Good evening, everyone, and welcome to the very first Eazy Cadet webinar. The intention is for me to give a a brief sort of intro into the collision avoidance regulations and to the different ways at which you can go about learning them. So that, as I say, this is the very first of a series of webinars that I hope to sort of bring to you guys. So let's jump straight in with an introduction as to what we're going to be talking about today. So today we're going to be discussing how we're able to actually learn. We're going to relate learning styles to the rules of the road. So if you've been struggling with learning the rules, this might be a slightly different approach, and it might give you a few ideas as to how to better approach learning and then applying the rules of the road, which may help if you've been struggling. Then I'm going to introduce the Eazy system for learning the collision avoidance regulations. So this webinar is all brought to you by the Eazy Cadet, which is the website that's sponsoring me to do these presentations. So a little bit of information about them. They are our sponsor. They are found at www.easycadet.co.uk. It's free to register, gives you access to the forums and a couple of free learning guides, one of which kind of covers the sort of things we're going to be talking about today. And it also has an orals preparation and booking system using a smooth online booking tool to prepare you for your orals examinations. So that is with current serving chief mates, masters, and a couple of lecturers as well, who are able to sort of take you for one-to-one or small group orals preparations. Memberships start at just £10 a month, and that gives you access to over 100 revision guides. So all of those revision guides focused on rule of the road, electronic navigation, all cargo, all these things are focused at passing your orals. So we are currently focused on Officer of the Watch level orals and HNC learning. Another thing the Eazy Cadet is doing is they're just in talks at the moment about publishing a new book. And this is the Guide to Learning the COLREGS. It's a brand new approach to learning. It's focused on learning styles and application of the rules rather than just memorizing a set of regulations. It's currently with the publishers, so hopefully available sort of July 2020. But these webinars will give you a pretty good insight into the way the book goes and the way that it works. So where to begin? If you've been struggling with learning the collision avoidance regulations, sort of keeping them in your memory, learning how to apply them, it could well be that it's because you haven't really found the style that's correct for you for learning. And it may well go to speak to how you've learned quite a few things throughout your life, but then other things you've struggled with and you haven't really found why you've struggled with those particular issues, whereas other things you've found quite easy. In the broadest sense of the word, there are 5 typical learning styles. These are all the different ways that people are able to actually sort of learn new information, process new information, and be able to recover that information in a way that kind of makes sense for them. The 5 styles, you've got oral or musical. So we'll go into each of them in detail in a minute. Logical, mathematical, physical, visual, and oral. And each of these different styles of learning is what will really lock any form of information in. So musical. It starts with a question, really. Can you remember song lyrics or music scores just with absolute ease? You listen to a song a couple of times, it comes out on the radio, and all of your friends are amazed that a couple of days later, you're just singing along, having learned all the words, just almost by osmosis. If you find that kind of fits with your day-to-day life, it's not a test. It's not everybody must do this. It's just some people have that innate ability to just hum a tune, listen to some words, listen to some lyrics, and then it all just sort of comes together in their mind. And when they recall the information, they don't recall the words, they recall the tune. They recall the way that the music made them feel and that emotive connection to whatever you're trying to learn. How does that help us learn the rule of the road? Well, it's actually very simple. Start to associate the rule of the road with some of your favorite music. Put music on in the background, quite low level. songs that you really like, that you really get into, and just have them at very low pitch, just in the background when you're trying to learn the collision avoidance regulations. What you'll find is you'll start to associate the rules with particular songs, and you know that because at the same point in that playlist you get to, you know that that's what the rule is, and you will hear the music in the back of your head while you're talking about the rules. And it's genuinely a very good way to actually learn anything if you're that way inclined. You can store large pieces of information just by associating them to sort of musical scores or lyrics. Logical, mathematical people. These people baffle the hell out of me, so I'm not a very logical, mathematical person for anyone that's ever come across me in another sort of guise. These are people who have the ability just to remember fascinatingly long sequences of numbers, equations, statistics. These are the same sorts of people. So if you find yourself able to recall how many goals a particular person scored in a particular championship 50 years ago, and you don't really know how you know that information, it just kind of works for you, that you read it once, you saw it, and then you can recall it at sort of any party or something where you're trying to impress people. These are also people that can read a long book and then just quote paragraphs of it afterwards. It's an incredible skill. If you are a logical, mathematical kind of person, you have probably already picked up a lot of the collision avoidance regulations just by reading the book, which is good. But what that tends to lead to is you lack a certain understanding of how to apply the rules correctly, because in a lot of circumstances, just saying the rule doesn't really explain the rule, and it doesn't show knowledge of it. So it's good, but you may have found yourself struggling with actually applying the rules in certain situations, which is where sort of knowing that this is the trap that you might fall into, it may be why you're struggling with applying the rules and answering rule type questions, because you're just sort of stating the rule as it is said, which is fine. Like we can help with that over the course of these lectures, because we can actually identify that this is who we are, and we can then move forward. Physical. So this is for all those people that sit in class and are just itching to get running, itching to get out, to move about, to sort of begin to move a little bit. And there's a very good reason for that. And it's these people have the ability to pick up games and new movements very, very quickly. You tend to find top athletes, dancers, ballerinas, those kind of people just have an innate ability to do a few movements, and then it gets locked into their mind. And when they're moving through a dance, it's almost like they're reciting a poem for somebody of a different sort of a mindset, and they have that ability just to think in terms of the movement of the body. Now, you're going to say that's really difficult to sort of translate to learning collision avoidance regulations, but it's actually a relatively simple exercise, and it's to do with just touching the thumb against each of the fingers in turn on each hand. So if you go with your right hand, thumb to index, thumb to middle, thumb to ring, thumb to little finger, and just as you're sort of trying to learn the rules, as you're trying to approach learning the rules, just be touching and moving your hand about while you're doing it. Another technique is something that sort of footballers use, and that's actually pretending that they're kicking a football under the table. And you'll see that if you ever watch sort of, I'll relate it to American football because it's the one I know the most. If you ever watch sort of videos of top athletes, especially American footballers, in a room trying to learn sort of vast pieces of information that's required for their game, you'll see that they tend to play with things. They'll have an American football in their hands and they'll just move it from side to side. Now, it's not them being bored with what's going on. It's that they know that their learning style is a physical learning style. they understand movement more than they understand words. So if they can take the written word and translate that into some sort of movement they find comfortable with, those are the sorts of things that you need to do if you are a physical learner. And trust me, you will know if you are a physical learner, because all throughout school, you've been told that you fidget too much or you move too much, but that's almost your natural body wanting to take in the information and associate it to some sort of movement. And that's it's actually quite a cool little style. If you recognize it and you're able to do it, it's very, very useful. Visual. So these learners, can you look at a painting and then just visualize it down to the individual brushstrokes of what you can see? The classic example, I have a very good friend of mine who is an incredible and very talented artist, and he can go to a gallery, wander around, and it sort of looks like he's not really paying that much attention to what's going on. But then we'll be sat in a cafe afterwards, and he'll have a sketchbook, and he'll be able to recreate a fair percentage of a painting that he's looked at, just in very rough drawing sketch form. And it's all to do with how his mind interprets the brush strokes and the lines and the way that things look on canvas in a very visual way. These people are the ones who tend to get accused of doodling on work while they're supposed to be listening. So you have that sort of ability to tune into what's being said, but at the same time, just drawing an inane drawing. What you then find, weirdly, is that you remember the doodle, not really what was being said. But there are certain techniques to be able to connect the visual learning to your actual sort of words, so that you are able to take something like the Collision Avoidance Regulations and associate it to patterns and associate it to brush strokes or small doodles, and then you start to think pictorially about the rules rather than actually thinking about the sort of written word. And that's again a very powerful technique, and you'll see these people create absolutely beautiful mind maps that sort of just take a concept and then work it all the way through these lovely diagrams all the way through to the end, and it will make no sense to anybody else, but they'll be able to remember each of the drawings all the way through the page and come up with a sensible and logical argument. So if you are that sort of artistic person, then again, there's things that we can do to work on that, to be able to bring that in so that you can express the Collision Avoidance Regulations and remember them in a way that makes sense. I think visual learners are the ones who actually, other than maybe physical, sort of struggle the most with the written word, or with trying to learn just by people talking at you, because you just completely zone out and just start drawing. So it's a lot harder, but much more rewarding when it does actually work. And then finally, oral. And being the person sat here talking with sillily not writing any notes, you'll find that this is actually how I learn, and this is my particular style. And it's people who can easily vocalize opinions, having just made up your mind, and you don't really, you take in all the information, but you take it in through the ears. Reading is sort of second nature to you. You're more about talking to people and finding out what their experiences are. Their experiences trigger emotions within you. Now, it's those emotional connection to the words that you've heard is what triggers the memory. And then you find it really easy to talk out loud, gather your thoughts just by talking, rather than sort of writing down a bunch of stuff and rereading it. And that's kind of what I'm doing at this moment in time. I didn't write notes for this. I just gave myself some visual clues up on the board, but I've been talking through this webinar in my head for the last couple of days, and having talked through it, I'm able to vocalize exactly what I need to as each slide comes up. And that ability is very, very powerful when combined with knowing that if you can hear something and form an emotional attachment to it, this sort of works. So that's just a very, very, very short and very brief introduction to the 5 major learning styles and how they work. And each person, now you may well have listened to that and think, well, none of that really applies to me. I'm sort of somewhere in the middle. Well, that's great. People who are actually in between learning styles have a huge advantage, because they have multiple ways of being able to take in information and then express that information. So if you're a physical and oral sort of person, you have the ability to take your actions and gestures and form an emotional attachment as people are talking, so you can then recreate what they are saying just by having that emotional attachment through the movement and through what you're listening to. So, you know, it's don't sort of think you have to pigeonhole yourself into one box. And for sure, the best way of trying to learn new information is to find the style that actually matches that thing that you're trying to learn. If I'm trying to learn a new language, I just need to immerse myself in it. I have to be speaking it, hear it spoken, and I try to watch as many TV shows as I can in that language and try and pick up the emotional connection to it. Somebody else who's learning to speak a language may well find it easier to pick up a game that is in that language. So you can start associating the movements of, let's say, something like lacrosse with the French language and how it works, and you have that ability then to sort of connect emotionally to the language through a game or an action or a movement. So it's an experimentation time, which is great. Like, everybody loves to sort of find a new way of doing something, and if you can take one of those 5 ideas and find a way that works for you, then you'll be onto a winner, because learning something like the collision avoidance regulations shouldn't really take a lot of time once you've got that mentality and style sort of locked down. Which brings us on to the crux, really, like the actual sort of reason we're here, which is how to actually learn the collision avoidance regulations. I'll be slightly critical here of the way things are sort of usually done, which is, when I started as a cadet, I was handed a little blue book and told, you need to learn this, every single word in it, and we're going to test you every week, and you're going to start at rule 1, and then you're going to go all the way through, and we're going to sign you off on all of your rules, and by the end of it, you will then somehow have learned the collision avoidance regulations. Now, some people may have had a similar experience if they were in a very similar company, or they may have had a completely different experience where they sort of were taken through very naturally, or sort of explained how things work. But however it was done, over the years, I've worked with the Eazy Cadet to sort of think about the ways in which we could actually break down the collision avoidance regulations in a way that makes sense, so that people sort of learn them almost like the alphabet, where if you're learning a language, learning the alphabet is the best place to start. Once you get all the letters and the vowel sounds, you can then move on to forming verbs and vocabulary and starting to get that connection. And then you can start slotting everything together. And once you've started to make the connections between what things are and how they work, you can then start to interpret how the rules should be working and how you should be applying them. So where do we start? I bet that's not what you thought. The contents page is actually the very simplest way of looking at the collision avoidance regulations. The most common mistake that people make in orals is not knowing which part or which section certain rules are and how they apply. The classic example is Rule 19. Rule 19 is... That's all right, none of you can talk. Rule 19 is restricted visibility, and it applies only when navigating in or near an area of restricted visibility with vessels not in sight of one another. The classic thing to happen is for them to put you in restricted visibility and give you a vessel forward of the beam on the starboard side that appears to be moving right to left. They ask you what's happening, and you say, oh, well, they're crossing. With a devious smile, the little examiner in front of you says, so which rule is going to apply then? And because you have just said the word crossing, you immediately jump on it and say, Rule 50, sir, because it's a crossing situation. And you failed. And you're not entirely sure why you failed, because everything sort of ends there and it all goes a bit hazy. It's because you've forgotten the basic principle of the rule of the road, which is the sections and what applies in which section. So if you can get your head around Part A, Part B, Part C, Part D, Part E, and then within them, so within Part B, there are 3 additional sections. Rules that apply at all times or in any condition of visibility, rules that only apply to vessels in sight of one another, and rules that only apply when you're not in sight of one another in or near an area of restricted visibility. So being able to sort of know exactly which rule sits where is your ABC. That is your very first tentative step of, okay, I now understand certain parts of how the collision avoidance regulations should be enacted. You then need to know Rule 3. And you must know everything that is contained within Rule 3. Rule 3, as it says on there, definitions. It is not the sexiest rule. It is not the one that immediately springs to mind when you think of, okay, I'm going to learn the rules, I'm going to hit Rule 3, which doesn't really say a lot. But it's very important. How can you apply the rules if you don't know what anything is? A very simple question. What is a power-driven vessel? A vessel propelled by machinery. Okay. When would a sailing vessel be considered constrained by her draft? And if you vaguely heard the word constrained by a draft before, you'll be able to cobble something together, even just by looking at it. Think, well, constrained by draft, she's got a deep draft and not a lot of water. And at that moment, unfortunately, your oars will end. And the examiner will be very, very nice to you and probably just say, come back in a couple of weeks. Because a sailing vessel can't be constrained by her draft under the rules. The rule is very, very clear. The term constrained by her draft means a power-driven vessel, which, due to the depth and width of navigable water, it's a very, very simple mistake. But it is one that can be very, very costly. And if you think of the contents page being your ABC, Rule 3 is your vocabulary. Rule 3 is everything that is covered within the rules. So you need to be able to speak the vocabulary before you're able to actually start to apply these rules. You need to know what a vessel restricted in her ability to maneuver is. What sort of vessels can be restricted in her ability to maneuver? Another classic one from sort of the oral situation is you are given a vessel not under command, and you, for some reason, say a power-driven vessel not under command. Now, although that's probably true, the term not under command just means any vessel which, due to some exceptional circumstance, cannot comply with the rules. What about a sailing vessel that has no propelling machinery in a flat calm with no wind and no other means of propulsion? Can she reliably alter course to avoid another vessel in if such a collision situation existed? Well, no, because she has no steering. She has no ability to move. Is she a power-driven vessel? No, she's just a vessel not under command, because she doesn't have that ability. What if you're on a rowing vessel and your oars snap? Same principle. You become a vessel not under command because you have no means of propulsion or steering or keeping out of the way of another vessel. But at no point were you power-driven. So you need to be able to make these distinctions because they're actually very important. And they are the sort of things that once you've built up an understanding of what each type of vessel is and what each term within the collision avoidance rules means, it will make your job a lot easier. You will start to understand the interplay between certain vessels. Rule 18, for example, becomes much easier to understand and interpret, because rather than just being, for the most part at the beginning, just lists of vessels that need to keep out of the way of each other, you can start to appreciate why certain vessels should be given a higher priority, because you start to understand that a vessel not under command, well, a vessel restricting her ability to maneuver, she's restricted. It doesn't mean she can't maneuver. She just might find it a bit difficult. A vessel not under command probably can't. Like there's probably very little maneuverability there for you to get to that stage. So that's why a vessel RAM would still probably give way to a vessel NUC, even though that's not explicitly said. It's just implied by the hierarchical order, which would be power-driven vessel, sailing vessel, vessel engaged in fishing, vessel restricting her ability to maneuver, and then a vessel not under command. So these sorts of nuances you find much easier once you have a very firm grasp of Rule 3. The third port of call should definitely be the lights and shapes. I know any of you who are sort of cadets at the time, or if you're going to be a cadet in the near future, or if you're just sort of out there sailing around, you will be sick to death of trying to learn the lights and shapes because it seems to be hammered home by everybody that this is the most important thing and this is what it's about. Unfortunately, in that instance, they're kind of right. It's very difficult to be able to avoid another vessel if you can't see it. And if you don't understand what that vessel looks like and what that vessel's markings are, you will come unstuck very quickly because you won't be able to identify it, you won't be able to classify it, and therefore you won't be able to avoid it, which are sort of the three logical steps of collision avoidance. You need to think of it as lookout duties. It is your first step to becoming a better officer of the watch. You cannot be an officer of the watch without being a lookout first. You must be able to look out of the window, spot the buoys, spot the other vessels, spot the lights and shapes, and just know instinctively what each of these are. You need to be able to recognize all of the special conditions by sight, at a distance, by night or day. Thankfully, in an orals sort of situation, distance doesn't really come into it. You're sat 3 feet from the examiner in most cases, although we'll see what happens with the new digital way of doing it. And they'll be put right in front of you. There should be no excuse for not understanding what they are. I'll put a caveat to that. It is very important to know what the patterns are. It is just as important to know what the arcs of visibility are. Ranges, I wouldn't be too fussed about learning them straight off the bat. If you get there eventually, yes, the whole 6 mile, 3 mile, 1.5 mile is quite useful to know. But these days, ships use LEDs. These lights are so bright, you'll see them from 15, 20 miles. Like, it's a legacy dating back to the 1970s when, you know, we were one step above using oil lanterns at that stage. So what you need to know is the arcs of visibility, because that will give you a very, very, very clear indication of the aspect of that vessel. And it's the magic word you'll keep hearing, and it's actually the topic of next week's webinar, the importance of aspect in the collision avoidance regulations. So before we even get to sort of starting to learn the rules and how they work and how they operate, you need to understand what the lights and shapes are telling you, having learned what each one is and being able to identify a vessel just by its light and shape. The next step then is to be able to determine the aspect of that vessel just by looking at it, which isn't difficult. That's what all of the lights and shapes are set up for. But this is the first sort of baby steps into how do we actually then start applying the rules. So that is the very essence of the beginnings of how we start learning the rules and making sure that we understand everything that is in that book, just by taking those three very basic points. Do we understand the contents page? Do we understand rule 3? And then, having understood the contents page in rule 3, can we identify these vessels by their lights and shapes as per rules 20 through to 30? That is the very first tentative steps of how we start being able to apply the collision avoidance regulations in any situation. That is kind of it. Like that, it's a short one to kick off, but the idea is not to sort of overload people. What I do have, though, you'll see from the sidebar, there's a live chat there. Now, I will attempt to endeavour to answer as many questions as you can sort of fire at me in the next 30 minutes with regards to sort of collision avoidance regulations, all that kind of stuff. I'd just say another quick shout out to my sponsors before I stop talking about the presentation. And remember to check out www.easycadet.co.uk and access amazing revision and learning materials. Now it's a race to see who can type the quickest. What will the upcoming webinars be on? Well, the next one is going to be on aspect, as I said. After that, it's going to be we're going to start the application. So we'll start off with rule 18 and then start to move on to rule 1, rule 2, and then sort of start to work our way through the rules, focusing on application rather than just learning. So I can click that. That's then been answered. In terms of understanding and learning the annexes, how does that compare to learning the rules? I'll be frank with you, only very, very strange people learn all of the annexes. Annex 1 is not really for seafarers. Annex 1 is for people who are going to design ships so that they get the lights and the cutoff zones and everything correct. I did once catch actually the cadet of the year in my year trying to learn all of the color gradients, which I found quite odd and disturbing. But there are certain parts of it that you definitely do need to learn. Annex 4. If you don't know Annex 4, upside down, back to front, and sort of sideways, you're going to struggle. Similarly, Annex 2 is definitely a one that you should know parts of. Annex 2 has a lot of sort of the fishing regulations for vessels in close proximity to one another. So a couple of flags, some different light designations that are definitely worth learning. With the annexes, though, you need to need to pick and choose what you're looking at. Don't try and learn things like, I'll show off a little bit and be really sad here and say that the mass of the striker compared to the mass of a bell for vessels greater than 100 meters should be not greater than 3%. Nobody will ever ask you that. It's just the sort of thing that people learn just to show off. So in terms of understanding and learning the annexes, there's a few nuanced bits in 2 that you will definitely need to know. And Annex 4, you should know inside out and back to front. Okay. And the next one is, what are your tips for learning Rule of the Road word for word? Don't. But I know that the Royal Navy sort of stake their oath on learning the rules word for word. So it can be done. I had to do it for a part of my career. That doesn't mean I could completely relate them to you right now, but there are any of the techniques I talked about at the beginning, any of the 5 techniques are absolutely perfect for learning long strings of information. So what you need to do for your friend who's in the RN is find a way that he learns other things. So if he's quite a sporty guy, go for a run. Find a free download that has the rules spoken and just listen to them while you're running. It will be the action and the motion of the running that will translate the words into the movement for you. If he's more of an aural learner, so music, put some music on, give it a go, see if that sort of stimulates. But definitely it's worth a conversation to find out what that learning style is, to then be able to cement the rules into your psyche. For me, it really was talking them like they were a speech. I would stand in the shower for hours at a time and just orate and say the rules again and again and again as many times as I could, as though I was giving a speech to a room full of people. And that's what cemented it for me. But I am an oral learner. That's how I work. So yeah, try one of the 5 techniques, give it a go, get back to me and see how it goes. The next question, what would you recommend in regards to the problem with construing the rules? Should we go with the MCA interpretation or the interpretation of, say, the captain on our ship? That depends in what situation it is. Especially when there is a difference of opinion. Yeah, I know that. I have been in that situation. So if you are standing on the ship, there is only one interpretation that matters of the rule of the road, and that's actually going to be a focus of another webinar that I'm doing with a very well-respected captain in the industry. We're going to talk about captain's interpretation. That is the one that matters when you're standing on the ship as the officer of the watch. Your interpretation, the MCA's interpretation, the world's interpretation does not matter. It is his ship, his train set. He will tell you how he wants that rule or those rules interpreted. For the orals, for an example, that is a different matter. And for the orals, you must go with the MCA interpretation. That is what the captain sat in front of you when you are studying orals or sat in the orals room will be expecting as a baseline. Now, the MCA's interpretation, usually I'm fairly spot on with it, and that'll be covered in the future. But the yes, there is a difference of opinion. There's a difference of opinion with some of the captains I sailed with, and I would say that theirs is probably more accurate than the MCA's interpretation. But for an orals, yes, you must be going with the MCA's interpretation, which is what I would proclaim it to be spouting, because I try not to formulate my own opinions, throw my own opinions on it. In terms of learning, yes, but in terms of actually interpreting, it's the way that the MCA would want it done. And then the next one, are webinars recorded for future reference? Yes, they should be. I will find out the moment I hang up, because it should all be recording. If it's not, there is a... I'm actually doing this webinar in its entirety again for another sort of a group on Saturday. So if this one doesn't record, it will definitely be recorded, and then I will actually ensure that they're recorded in future. But I'm going to try and record as many as I can. Next question. Any good resource practically practicing rules, drawings or videos, especially with multiple vessels? Yes. And good news, it's not going to cost you a lot of money. In the most part, I would say the best way to practice multiple vessel scenarios is actually to grab a couple of pieces of paper, put them on the floor of the room, and sit in as though you were sat on one of the vessels and try to determine what is actually happening and what's going on, and create that situation. Drawings or videos is an interesting one. The Eazy Cadet does have a YouTube channel. There are a couple of videos on there, but at the moment it's still a growing process. So as the animations start to come in, and as we start to sort of build on them, then yes, there will certainly be videos explaining the collision avoidance rules. Drawings, I don't think I've ever come across anyone who's actually done visual representations of the rules, which is an interesting point. So I think that's definitely something that I should really be looking at. Thank you for that. That's actually very interesting. Yeah, multiple vessels is an interesting one. It's if you're lining up for sort of chief mates masters, I'll be telling you that multiple vessels is the only thing you should be thinking of. At the cadet level, I haven't seen many. So if you are at the cadet level, don't try and overcomplicate it too early. The only time it may come up is in restricted visibility, but that's a whole different set of issues, and they're really after your radar plotting more than your interpretation of the rules. But yeah, that's a good question. I'll need to have a think about that. Thank you. Okay, next one. What do you anticipate being different about orals conducted online versus face-to-face? If it's a radar plot or do chart work examples over the internet? Your guess is as good as mine on this one. I'm yet to hear of anybody actually taking an online oral. I've been in the meetings where they've been discussed. I have sat very patiently and listened to what's going on. I don't know is the answer. A radar plot will be very, very difficult to achieve, as will chart work. Speaking as somebody who's currently trying to teach chart work through a computer to people who don't have charts. It can be done. The principles remain the same, regardless of whether you're on a blank piece of paper or if you're on a chart. It's just slightly easier to be accurate if you've got things to fix off. I think you'll find that the orals online, if they ever come into fruition and being, I think you're going to find them a lot harder. I think it will genuinely be a lot more difficult to achieve that kind of a situation. The orals that I've sat through were a very sort of visceral experience. I don't know whether that's just because I read too much into situations, or if I sort of try to make a connection with somebody, but I find it quite difficult to make connections with people over Skype and over the internet. Whereas in the room, you can sort of get a feeling of how things are going by the rapport that you've got, and I get the feeling it'll be a lot more formal, if that makes sense. I think they'll be very concerned about doing things exactly correctly by the book, whereas some of the examiners that I had were a little bit more laissez-faire, let's say, with sort of the way that they would ask questions or the way they would start by sort of chat. I mean, I was very lucky that my chief mates examiner, for example, taught me at college. So we had a little chat about the college and sort of how things had gone since, and a little bit of celestial navigation before we even started, because he knew I had an interest. So yeah, I think it will be very, very different. I think it's not something maybe to be scared of, but it's something to bear in mind, that it will be a lot more formal than even you would expect it to be, because I think there's going to be this expectation that things are going to be recorded and things are going to be sort of written down and a little bit more dogmatic than they have been in the past. So it's definitely something to bear in mind, and I would definitely make sure that I've combed my hair, put on a decent suit and tie, even though I'm just talking to a computer screen, because it's going to be very difficult to make that impression of professionalism and sort of candor through a computer screen. And that is sort of half the battle of an oral, is looking at the examiner in the eye and him thinking that you are capable of standing the watch. And that's that's sort of where that is. So yeah, it's a good question. Hopefully when someone goes up for an online oral, I'll be able to get some feedback and find out sort of how it went and what happened. To add to the question, I guess it would be harder to make scenario-based questions. Would have used model ships in the past. What would college queues look like in an oral? COLREG questions. Okay, what would COLREG questions look like in an oral? Yeah, it depends really. It depends on the examiner. You can't go far wrong with a Smarty board, to be honest with you. A Smarty board still translates beautifully across a camera. Certain people have made sort of digital careers out of just using the Smarty board and asking questions of people. So I don't think it'll actually look all that different in terms of the collision avoidance questions. Voyage will be interesting, because that usually relies on them sort of putting them in a line in front of you on the table. However, it depends what they're using. Like if they're just using a webcam on, let's say, something like a Gorilla Pod, manipulation of that's very easy. So angling the camera down to then look at the table and sort of talk through that isn't beyond the realms of possibility. So yeah, will it be vastly different to what you've seen? I shouldn't think so. Speaking from a sort of education psychology point of view, people don't like being outside of their comfort zone. They like asking questions in a way that they are used to asking them. And when people are presented, even with new technology, they tend to revert to type. They will probably find a way of presenting the models to you on the table. The easiest way of doing that is probably just angling the camera down and pointing them at them. So I can't envisage them sort of, I don't expect them to suddenly have 3D models in the computer, which they then manipulate. I mean, the MCA don't like change. So I wouldn't be sort of looking in that avenue. I think it would probably definitely be based around the Smarty board and then Voyage on the table, if anything, is the sort of way I'd expect. Again, that's my opinion, coming at it from someone who's tried to teach online at a drop of a hat with very little setup time. So you just find ways of doing stuff in a familiar way for you that makes sense. I hope that answers the question without rambling too much. Can be a good resource for cadets. Remembering part B of the rules is easy enough. I should find translating that to practical situations on the bridge, multiple close quarter situations, more difficult. Only focused on single vessel scenarios for Officer of the Watch rules. Yes, like there's a reason why, as a junior Officer of the Watch, you struggle with multiple vessel sort of thinking, and that's because the experience level just isn't quite there. I would say to any Officer of the Watch who's a junior, maybe only been qualified a couple of years, if you got multiple vessels in the first couple of weeks on the ship that I'm on and you're not comfortable, give me a call, because it's better to talk through that situation before we get there, and we can have a chat about all the different ways of dealing with this situation, rather than you calling me when we're at 2 nautical miles to a collision. I actually had a captain who had a brilliant thing written in his standing orders, which was any officer of the watch, doesn't matter whether you've been qualified for 20 years or 20 minutes, any officer of the watch who finds themselves in a collision avoidance situation in the first couple of weeks with multiple vessels, please call me, because I would like to discuss how I prefer the ship to be handled in that situation. Which was a wonderfully delicate way of a captain saying, it's my ship, I would like you to interpret the rules as I interpret them. And it meant that when I was dealing with multiple ships for the first sort of times in busy traffic lanes, I wasn't alone. And I think putting that onto anybody at the Officer of the Watch level is definitely asking a lot, with multiple close quarter situations. There's a reason why NASTO, the hardest it ever gets is a 2-ship plot. Now, a 2-ship plot with some very, very clear parameters, and that is they must not alter course, they must not alter speed, and it must be very, very clear as to what the other vessels are doing, and there must be only one answer. So that answer will either be to slow down or to alter course. When you start getting into multiple ship plots, when you start getting into multiple ship scenarios, there's not always a clear answer. It starts to become a little bit woolly, because you may be able to alter course for 3 of the vessels, but not for 1 of them. And then it becomes a weighing up process as to which one you do. And then it sort of comes down to experience. So yes, you will find it difficult to translate part B to multiple ships at this stage in your career. I would say 99% of your focus right now should be single vessel alterations and single vessel scenarios, because you're trying to run before you can walk, and that's always going to lead to confusion. And the worst thing is if you practice and practice and practice multiple ship scenarios, your thought process starts to become slightly warped, because you start to think of the least bad option rather than what is the interpretation of the rule. So that would be my suggestion for Officer of the Watch. Stick to single vessel, even though it seems a little bit sort of slow paced, because it will solve a lot of the confusion. And the next one thing I can't get wrong is COLREGS. That is absolutely true. The one thing you cannot get wrong is COLREGS. The examiner might throw you a bone and let you think about it again, but this is the sort of time where you need to take a deep breath before you answer. The level of depth one goes far deeper than I initially thought. That is definitely true. How deep should one go into COLREGS? Cockcroft and Lamier, yes. A guy, for those reading the chat that haven't come across this book, Cockcroft and Lanier is the a guide to the collision avoidance regulations written by lawyers. It's a great book. I have my own copy. It's good, but it is really pitched at quite a high level. It's the sort of book that I would hand to a brand new master and say, now that you've got to master, please go and read this book. What it does do is it gives you some very interesting pointers as to some of the thought processes as to what captains may well be thinking of. To that end, I mean things like safe speed, for example. It talks about a 1965 collision that occurred in UK waters, and it talks about the process that they went through at the investigation, and they determined that safe speed should really be able to be stopped in half the appreciable visibility. So if your stopping distance is a mile, you should have a good appreciable visibility of at least 2 nautical miles, so that you are able to be stopped in half of that visibility. Now, I'm sure a lot of you have sort of maybe heard that term before, of sort of be stopped in half the visibility, but maybe not know where it came from. Cockcroft and Lamier is the sort of book that if you are ever in trouble and you need to go to a tribunal or you need to go to a criminal court of law, please hand that book to whichever lawyer is representing you and point to the rule that applies and tell him how you complied with it, because it's basically all of the case law that tells you exactly why or how the rules are interpreted at a board of inquiry level or a criminal trial level. Should you be reading it as a cadet? I have said to cadets in the past, it's definitely worth reading. It's definitely worth reading once you have an appreciation of what's going on. But you need to get to that level first. So yes, it's a great book. Yes, I do use it myself. Don't try and read it in one go. And don't try and sort of go into your orals thinking that, oh God, I haven't learnt everything in Cockcroft and Lamier, therefore I'm going to fail. You do not need to be at that level. Like that is way beyond the scope of the Officer of the Watch, Cockcroft. But there are good nuggets in it. The one I always used to throw out when I was teaching was a roadstead. Everybody who can parrot the rules parrot fashion can tell you that a roadstead is mentioned in the rules. But what is it? For those that maybe don't know, it's a sheltered anchorage, usually sheltered by a reef or some sort of naturally forming barrier. You only know that by reading books like Cockcroft, because they actually explain that. A lot of the books just kind of skim over those things. So yeah, it's good, but don't take it as gospel that Cockcroft is the way, because it really is quite sort of high level for this Officer of the Watch level. Okay. I would say that is probably the best comment to end this session on. It is good to know we're not expected to know multiple scenarios in depth. More guidance on calling the master. I will leave you with this thought. Yep. There have been many people that have failed their orals on Rule of the Road. Of that, I would say about 90% of them failed because they didn't call the master at the Officer of the Watch level. They can tart it up however they like, saying that the examiner was sort of twisting and asked a really awkward question. And my response to any cadet that's ever said that to me, or any person that's ever said that to me, actually, about orals, I've said, did you call the master? And they look at me quizzically and say, no. So, were you in doubt sat in that chair? Honestly, were you in doubt when he asked you that question? He said, yes. I said, right. You probably should have called the captain. And that's exactly what you should be doing at your level, the Officer of the Watch level. Multiple ships, call the master. That's what he's there for. Any master that's worth his salt will tell you the same. If you've got 5, 6, 7 ships, busy traffic lane, lots going on, you are going to very quickly become overloaded. And if you start focusing on just one ship, that's going to cause issues. If you start trying to focus on too many ships, you're going to miss something important. And that is where there is no sort of gauge for experience. Like there is no no substitute for it. Like only someone who has a long experience of being at sea will be able to look at that situation and apply the rules as required at that moment. So please don't feel bad at the Officer of the Watch level if you're coming up against some of these situations and you just can't work it out. That is the moment you should be phoning the master to get that level of experience and advice, because then when that situation comes up again, you'll have that experience to call upon, not just the rules. So thanks, guys. That's been a great session in my opinion. When you log out, there'll be a just a very short questionnaire. It's only one question. It's just, what would you guys like to see in the future? Because if you have a couple of topics that want to be looked at, chances are 10 other people will. And the more topics, the more questions that people ask, and the more I'm put on the spot and have to answer questions, I think the more people are actually going to learn. So yeah, thanks very much. The next webinar for next week will be sort of going live tomorrow. So just look out for it. Please register, tell your friends, and see you later. Thank you very much.